Hi, and welcome back to Football Made Simple.
A massive match at the very top of the table ended 3-1 to Pep City, putting them level on points with Arsenal, although the Gunners do have a game in hand. City had more XG, however, this Arsenal side became one of the very few to utterly dominate possession against a Pep team. So what tactics did we see on display from both Arteta and Guardiola? Let's take a closer look. And we'll begin with the Arsenal domination in possession. Arteta's Arsenal were, as usual, a smooth machine when it comes to rotating positions and creating angles in order to maintain possession, and throughout the 90 they morphed into different build-up shapes that City found hard to contain at times. Initially, Arsenal built up with a back two, with Tomiyasu operating more as a traditional fullback and Zinchenko immediately tucking into the midfield, alongside Jorginho, which allowed Odegaard and Xhaka to advance into the half spaces as they love to do. And this was perhaps the shape that City didn't mind too much, as they defended in what could either be a 4-4-2 or 4-3-2-1 depending on the scenario. When Arsenal built up like this, we more often saw City use the 4-3-2-1, with Rodri, De Bruyne and Gundogan operating deeper, and this shape would give them a better chance at preventing the overloads with the men in the half spaces, as Gundogan and De Bruyne could watch them, whilst Rodri could still be the spear man. Haaland would be the highest man high up, but Mahrez and Grealish would tuck in extremely narrow, looking to pick up these men, and they were happy to leave space on the left and the right. So here we see De Bruyne, Rodri and Gundogan deeper, with the wider of the three able to pick up men in the half spaces, whilst Mahrez and Grealish have pushed higher up, able to pick up the double pivot of Jorginho and Zinchenko, helping to clog up the centre of the pitch. But Arsenal, of course, had different ways of dealing with this shape from City. Firstly, Jorginho was often very willing to drop into the back three and receive the ball, and because City were determined to keep pressure on the double pivots, the man would naturally be drawn out, either Grealish or at times we did see Gundogan being drawn out. And this would now create a little bit more space in the midfield region, especially as we saw when Tomiyasu pushed up wide, Saka could come in narrow, allowing Odegaard to move deeper, or Nketiah was also willing to drop deep when it was required. So in this scenario, it was Xhaka who dropped deeper and he drew Rodri towards him. This then opened up more space than usual in this midfield zone, and both Martinelli and Nketiah are looking to drop in to take advantage of it. And this extremely narrow initial shape was an interesting decision from Pep, as he made defending the centre of the pitch the priority against a team with excellent 1-versus-1 wingers in Saka and Martinelli. Down Arsenal's left, that was probably fine because Walker is one of the best 1v1 defenders in the world. But this also placed a lot of trust in Bernardo Silva on the left-hand side to be disciplined to take on Saka, who is one of the best wingers in the league. And we did see that for the most part he was able to do this, but Saka caused him major problems, leading to a yellow card in the first half, and Silva eventually having to be moved to the wing. But of course Arteta adapted to this defensive shape quite quickly. And the obvious space was on the left-hand side, so what we would see in these scenarios is that often Xhaka, instead of staying high up in the half space, where he was harder to access, would look to drop into the left-back zone, so that now this would often leave Mahrez with a decision. He could stay in narrow on Zinchenko and leave the man free, which would then drag the midfield out of position, or he could be more conservative and drop deeper, forming more of a 4-4-2, but this would then lead to a midfielder having to be dragged out of position, leaving space higher up the pitch. So here we see that initial shape with De Bruyne, Rodri and Gundogan deeper, and Grealish and Mahrez either side of Haaland. And initially, Mahrez is looking to remain in this more central position, where he can both press a centre-back or hang on to Zinchenko. But Zinchenko then moves into the vacated space, so now the City midfield has to shift across and is slightly more spread out. And here's another scenario where initially Mahrez is deeper, but out of shot, Xhaka has moved into the left back zone. So this time Mahrez can't continue his press and instead opts to move deeper. So now De Bruyne from midfield has to be the man to press. And Arsenal work it well so that now Gabriel has space to attack. But with City being persistent with this central shape, Arteta then shifted to use Xhaka pretty much as a traditional pivot for most of the game, allowing Zinchenko to start wider and do less inverting as the game went on, because he's an influential player for Arsenal on the ball, and this is where the space was out wide. So, when Mahrez was caught central, either in this shape or as we'll see, the 4-4-2, Zinchenko was aggressive in pushing high up the pitch. And one thing that Arsenal did well is that when the ball was wide, they would consistently look to overload the box. With runs from Xhaka, Odegaard, and Nketiah, and if the ball was on the left-hand side, Saka would always look to be in the space on the outside. So here we see that Xhaka is deeper, operating as a traditional pivot, and Zinchenko has moved to the left wing/left back. And this has also allowed Martinelli to move into a more central zone, and he can be the extra man in the midfield and receive the progressive pass. Again, Mahrez is caught more central, so the space is with Zinchenko, who's operating at left back. And Arsenal are already getting plenty of men central to then eventually look to overload the box. So as the game went on, to counteract this, City began to defend in a more traditional 4-4-2, with either De Bruyne or Mahrez joining Haaland, and the other one dropping to right wing. However, this wasn't the antidote to all of City's defensive problems, as Arsenal still had ways of causing problems. If City were operating with a wider, more traditional 4-4-2, with Haaland and De Bruyne at times getting caught high up the pitch, City could be overloaded badly in this region with just the double pivot, as it could either be a 3 versus 2, or if Zinchenko pushed high and wide early, Martinelli in this half space could make it somewhat of a 4 versus 2. So with Gundogan and Rodri being drawn to the men in the half spaces, Nketiah could at times get the room to drop in to get onto the ball and then look to face the goal. So here we see City's 4-4-2, and initially the forwards are picking up the double pivot. But as the play progresses, we see that Haaland is caught the wrong side of the ball, so Arsenal have somewhat of an overload in this central zone, allowing Xhaka to be found between the lines, and he finds Odegaard, who can eventually find Saka for a decent opening. So what we would see alternatively is that in this 4-4-2, City would operate much narrower, with Mahrez and Walker often drawn in towards Martinelli, meaning that Zinchenko would still be the free man out wide, and he would be able to get into crossing zones. And if the fullback was drawn to him, he could be backed up by runs from Martinelli into the half space, or even Xhaka from deeper regions. But despite having so much of the ball, the wingers didn't get past their men in 1v1 situations a lot, and City, being super compact for the most part, prevented clear-cut opportunities. This was aided in the second half when Pep brought on Akanji to be a centre-back, allowing Silva to move to right wing, and Ake, a natural defender, to operate as the left back. This was helpful in having a traditional defender at left back, but also, down the left hand side where Arsenal were looking to make inroads, they now had to contend with Bernardo Silva, who has an unstoppable engine and could look to cover wide and come central as he saw fit, making City much harder to penetrate down the flanks. And despite scoring 3 times, City weren't too impressive on the ball in open play. But let's see what they looked to do and how Arsenal defended well for the most part. When building up from the back, Diaz and Ake would split either side of Ederson, and Silva would immediately look to invert to be the second pivot alongside Rodri, allowing Gundogan and De Bruyne higher up the pitch. But Arsenal are effective at pressing teams from the goal kick, as we've seen throughout the season, with Nketiah often joined by Saka in central zones to create a front 2, whilst it was Odegaard and Xhaka who would then look to pick up the pivots. And in this line, Jorginho could look like he was 2 versus 1 down, but Arteta also had enough faith in his defenders to potentially allow a centre-back to follow De Bruyne deep, so that there wouldn't be an easy outball into the midfield. What this meant from this shape is that Ederson, if he decided to go short, could only go to Diaz or Ake, and as soon as a man received, one of the forwards would press, and most of the other options higher up the pitch were already covered, and time and again, City were forced long to Haaland. One way Ederson did look to adapt was by knowing that Arsenal were playing a pseudo back 3, he looked to go long to the wingers, trying to initiate 1 versus 1 situations. However, as they were receiving aerial balls with their back to goal, it was difficult for them to be too effective when they received in this zone, although this is what led to the goal. So here we see Saka pressing Ake, Nketiah can press Diaz or Ederson, whilst Gabriel from centre-back is looking to drop onto De Bruyne, who is the free man in the midfield. And Grealish potentially have 1 versus 1 situations, which Ederson was looking to find often. But he goes long to Haaland. City force a back pass, and De Bruyne finishes excellently. But for the most part, Arsenal's pressing shape was extremely efficient, forcing Edison long 26 times, which is a rarity. But if Arsenal wanted to be more conservative, they could also keep the back four, and instead press in a more traditional 4-1-4-1, with Nketiah's role in these situations being that when the ball went wide to one side or the other, he would look to cut off the lateral passing lane back into Edison, meaning the only obvious pass would be to the fullback, who could then be pressed. And even in deep defensive areas, Arsenal were disciplined, dropping into a 4-4-2 as they always do. At times, with Gundogan and De Bruyne being in the half spaces, we could see the Arsenal pivots being split. However, where in previous matches we have seen Haaland dropping into deeper zones to try and pick up the pass, in this match his priority was more in being a target man or running in behind, so he didn't tend to do that too much. In addition, when Arsenal were in a more settled shape, Odegaard and Nketiah would be deep on the pivots, meaning that they would be difficult to overload in the midfield despite on paper only having two pivots. Odegaard and Nketiah were disciplined in being fairly deep in order to form Arsenal's 4-4-2, making central progression difficult as well. Arsenal were effective for the most part in defending, but gave away 2 of the goals, cheaply, making it hard to get a result. This result means that the season is perfectly poised, with both sides still having the league in their hands. And it will be interesting to see if Arteta's young gunners can hold their nerve. For the manager tactical score, Arsenal were the better team for most of the match, but that didn't translate into chance quality, meaning Arteta earns a 7. City were for the most part outdone and got slightly fortunate with Arsenal shooting themselves in the foot, but they were still clinical enough to finish, meaning Pep earns a 5.5. But what are your thoughts? Drop them down below.
I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, you might enjoy the content available on my Patreon. Not only does Patreon help to support the continued production of content, as I am a one-man team, but it also gives you early access to videos that will come on the channel. You'll also get exclusive videos, get to vote on polls, and so much more. And it's cheaper than ever, no longer having a tier system, so everyone on the Patreon gets access to all the content. So head over to patreon.com/footballmadesimple to check it out.
But that's all for today, and remember, keep it simple.